Hi everybody, welcome back to PCS 101, and this happens to be for our class for Wednesday, the 6th of January, where we are continuing to discuss the textbook as we get ready for speech number 1. And as I had indicated last class, if you could please send me an email to Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu if you think you would like to present speech number 1 via Zoom on Monday the 11th with your times of availability, and what I will try to do is find a common time. For everybody else, you can upload your speech. What I will do over the weekend is that I will put up a folder in our Moodle so that you can post your speech there. And one of the things the class will be doing after you post your speech is everybody will be viewing their classmates' speeches and giving some brief feedback on those speeches to me. So in terms of the practice session, I wanted to touch base with all of you, but it can be informally, before you actually deliver your speech so that I can make sure that you don't have any questions or concerns. And again, if you can send me an email to ruiz@gcc.mass.edu indicating when you might be available for such a practice session and how you would like to do that practice session. We can do it via Zoom, but we can also do it via chat. We can do it via email. We can even do it via telephone. The practice session needs to occur before Monday the 11th. As you know, this upcoming Friday, I have scheduled a quiz, and basically that's all you have for that particular class. So Friday might be a very good day for posting or for setting up a time for a practice session, but I realize that might not be possible for all of you. So please contact me and we'll try to find a mutually agreeable time. Where we are is talking about the next steps of pulling together a speech. Last class we talked a little bit about speeches and higher education and all of the different reasons why it is we study public speaking. And we also talked a little bit about the process of getting started and some of the ways that we could think about preparing for not just our first speech, but for all speeches. And then finally, we talked a little bit about critical listening and the importance of making sure that you listen carefully as an audience member. And I had indicated that in the textbook, there are some questions for you to consider about critical listening. But I also wanted to draw your attention to the speech ratings sheet, which I had included with our syllabus and our course outline. And you can find that in the section above in Moodle, where I will be using that sheet for our first speech. Outside of the first speech, then I'll just be taking notes, so I won't be using a template at all. But that'll give you an idea of some of the things that you should be considering when you are pulling together a speech, and some of the things you should be considering when you are listening to the speeches of others. So in terms of thinking about critical listening when it comes to a particular speech, you need to think about both the content and the delivery of the speech itself. So those are basically two elements to consider. And the first, content, the introduction, which we will be talking about in greater depth as well. Is there an introduction that gets the audience's attention? It could be as simple as saying hello, but you want to make sure that you're cueing the audience that you are ready to begin your speech. And then some sort of a transition for a preview to probably what is your thesis or your main point. And then we move to the body, and that happens to be where you've got your evidence and your details. Is there a clear pattern? One of the things we'll be talking about is organizing and outlining. Are the main points stated? Are those points developed adequately? Are there any voice mannerisms, ums or ahs or things of that nature? Are the words well chosen in terms of understanding that a speech would never be as precise as the paper, but still you want to be clear enough so that your audience understands what it is that you're saying? And then ultimately the conclusion, which is probably where you restate your main points and then you give some sort of a concluding statement or some sort of closure. In terms of the delivery, things like eye contact, body movement, vocal quality, and that includes things such as volume, Articulation. How well are you forming your words? In other words, are you not mumbling? Which is different from pronunciation, which is how you form your words in terms of pronouncing or stating a particular word. And we'll talk about both. And your enthusiasm. Even if you aren't necessarily enthusiastic, you want to appear enthusiastic to your audience. Because if you're not enthusiastic, there really isn't any reason for them to be enthusiastic. So today's lesson is about organizing and outlining, and that's probably the most important part of the speech. So you know where we left off is that you know you're giving a 5-minute autobiographical speech, but you don't necessarily know what it is that you're going to be sharing with the audience outside of the fact that it has something to do with your life and your life experiences. So by the ending of the speech, the audience should know a little bit more about you than they did than when the speech started. And in fact, I will be showing over the next couple classes some sample student autobiographical speeches so you can get an idea of how you could proceed. Those students are in no way affiliated with GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day you might end up being a sample student speech. So we can be hypercritical with these speeches because we don't know these students. These are individuals who either posted their speeches publicly on YouTube, so I consider that that's available for basically public consumption. Or these were students who were in one way or another hired by textbook companies so that their speeches could be used as sample speeches. In terms of this class, with it being online, it's much easier to just use the speeches that are posted on YouTube, which is what we will be doing. But nevertheless, one of the good things about YouTube is that you can see that once I've selected a speech, YouTube will generate lots of other options for similar kinds of speeches. So you could literally spend hours watching practice speeches if you so wanted to. The organizing and the outlining is so important with the speech because this is the prep work. The more prepared you are, then the less likely it is that you will experience nerves. And in fact, that was one of the attendance questions that I asked is, well, what are some ways to deal with nerves? The textbook had discussed this as well, and so did the Toastmasters video as well. Being well prepared is definitely one of the best ways. And I can say that as a teacher, the more often you have taught a particular class, the easier it is to teach it just because you happen to know the material. Other techniques you can use to reduce nerves are to breathe deeply. And in fact, it's been shown that during times of stress and anxiety, people don't breathe very deeply at all. So breathing deeply from the diaphragm, holding it for 3 seconds, the air, and then releasing it. And I usually suggest that you do that for approximately 3 times, just so that you can get oxygen into your system. It also helps to breathe during the speech. I've had students even write cues to themselves in their outline to breathe, just so that they can remind themselves to do that. And many times when students use ums and ahs, or when speakers use ums and ahs, what they're trying to do is to get breath into them. So it would be better to take a quiet pause. Other techniques for reducing nerves, things like exercise and making sure that you're well hydrated, making sure that you're well fed, making sure that your environment is one that feels comfortable to you. And that includes the clothes that you happen to be wearing. And certainly you don't necessarily have to dress up as if this were a formal presentation and we were in a lecture hall. But you would want to be wearing clothing that is respectful to your audience, but also is comfortable to you. And I always suggest don't wear something new when you're delivering a speech, because the chances are that you don't know how it's going to feel when you first wear it, and you might regret that choice. You might end up thinking more about your shoes or your outfit than about the actual speech itself. There's even some suggestions that things like scent, lavender in particular, can help to reduce anxiety. Color therapy, blues and greens in particular, have been shown to reduce anxiety. Music has been shown to reduce anxiety, particularly classical music. Again, much of this is very personal, so you have to decide what your tastes are. But all of these are ways that you can think about managing nerves. But the number one suggestion I have is to be well prepared, to make sure that you are well organized and that you've put together a solid outline. That makes your speech easier to remember, and it makes it easier to present. And You might also find when you are going through this is that your speech becomes much more credible just because you've taken the time to organize it well. And that means that your speech could be more persuasive. And this will be something that'll be particularly important at the ending of the semester when we do our persuasive speeches. So, the chapter about organizing and outlining discusses that you need to have a thesis, some sort of a central idea. And as I talk about in my writing classes, you may not necessarily know your thesis initially. You may have to discover it over the course of constructing an outline. And in fact, I've had students who tell me that they're much more comfortable writing papers than they are delivering speeches. And what I suggest to them is that they might want to write a short paper that is autobiographical in nature, and then reduce it to speaking notes, keywords, and phrases, and then basically tell the audience, with the assistance of their outline if necessary, what their paper was about. So you can work backwards. I've also suggested in my writing classes to students who feel uncomfortable with writing that what they might want to do is speak out their paper and record it and then transcribe that. And then what they might find is basically a rough outline for the actual paper itself. So the organizational plan. All speeches have to be divided into an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. But outside of that, there are many different ways that you can organize the elements within a speech. And my suspicion has been that you have probably thought about these and utilized these with your own writing. So for instance, chronological or time is a very intuitive way to organize elements that you are discussing in a speech or that you are writing about in a paper, especially if you're talking about a process, for instance, how to do something. So you go through the first, the second, the third. Topical. In other words, you've got main topics that you divide your speech or your paper into. And you might want to order those topics based on order of importance, putting the most important first so that you can impress your audience, or putting the most important last so that you can leave with a lasting impression. And I can't necessarily say one is better than another. Certainly you can impress your audience by putting the most important first, but then the rest of your speech might be a bit of a letdown. And certainly you can wait until the ending of the speech to end with your most important arguments so that you leave with a good impression. But are you going to be able to hold on to your audience's attention until you get to that point? So a lot of it is going to be based on individual preference, as well as the subject that you happen to be discussing and the audience that happens to be listening. You might want to talk about something in terms of its spatial elements or its locations, which works very nice if you're describing the appearance of something. Or maybe you want to talk about something causally and you want to show a relationship of cause and effect. And you can mix and match these. I oftentimes use the example of a real estate agent who's trying to sell a house, let's say. And there are many different ways that the real estate agent can go about presenting this house. Part of the decision will be based on the house itself. Obviously, the house has strengths and weaknesses. Part of the decision will be based on the real estate agent themselves and their level of comfort with organizing things in one way or another. And part of it will be based on the audience, or let's say the individuals who happen to be viewing that house. So for instance, if we were to talk about that house from a chronological perspective, that would work very well if the house was, let's say, very old, from the, let's say, late 1700s, and it's on a National Historical Registry. It might also work very nicely for a very new house, new construction, where no one has ever lived in. I don't know if that would be the best organizational technique for a house that's approximately 40 years old. It's not necessarily new, but it's not necessarily old. Perhaps you would want to talk about that house from a topical perspective, that there are 3 elements in the house that you wanted to emphasize: the price, the location, and perhaps the new roof that's been installed. And in fact, you could perhaps order those in terms of order of importance, but of course that will be dependent on your audience. So for one couple viewing the house, the location of the house might be most important because they have a young child and they're concerned about school districts. But then the next group that happens to be viewing the house, they're first-time home buyers, so the price point is going to be the most important. So again, you adapt based on the topic or the subject matter that you're discussing, the audience, the individuals that you are presenting to, and of course, you want to utilize your strengths in terms of your presentation. If you were to talk about that house spatially, you could describe what it looks like. That when you enter the house, immediately to the right happens to be a door that goes to the garage. Immediately to the left happens to be a living room. There's a staircase that's immediately in front of you, and up that staircase there is a kitchen. Off to the right is a spare bedroom that could be used as a den. Off to the left is a dining room, and then ultimately off of that dining room there's sliding glass doors onto a deck. Now, obviously, you've never been in this house, but my description spatially gives you at least a sense of what it could look like. So there are lots of different ways that you could go about organizing once you've determined your intro, your body, and your conclusion. Some suggestions that I have. What works very well with audiences is talking about things that are familiar. This is an old teacher technique where they often talk about old material before they introduce new material. Question and answers work very nicely. Asking an audience questions tends to engage the audience, makes them invested in things. Showing a problem and a solution. This works very nicely for something like a persuasive speech. There has to be some sort of a problem in order for you to motivate individuals to take a particular action or to support a particular behavior. Or you can also go through a process of elimination as well. Your speaking outline is going to be key with all of this, and you may have experience with writing outlines for papers. When you're writing an outline for papers, you want to be as detailed as possible. The idea is the more work you put into the outline, then the less work you have to put into the construction of the paper. It's the exact opposite in terms of public speaking. Less is more. Key words and phrases, because you want an outline that will be useful to you to jog your memory while you are delivering your speech. So you don't want to be in a position where you have to read the speech. You want to be able to interact with the audience. If you've noticed, below these videos, what I've been doing is posting the class notes. And I've been posting them in the outline format that I personally tend to like and I find very useful. Keywords and phrases divided up into categories and subcategories sometimes. That said, you can utilize whatever technique is comfortable to you. You just want to make sure that the outline will be useful to you in the event that you needed to refer to it. And it's quite possible that you would need to refer to it because you're so well prepared. And that's part of the reason why you construct an outline, so that you can be organized and prepared. I liken the outline to, let's say, the net a trapeze artist might use during a performance. A good trapeze artist doesn't fall, so they don't need the net. But a good trapeze artist knows they might fall, so the net should always be there. And I think it's the same with the speaking outline. You may not need it, but it should always be there. And in fact, I've got one right in front of me right now, so you might see me occasionally looking down. These are the notes that I happen to post at the bottom of our videos. So this gives me an idea of what to talk about, and then of course I just fill it in with unscripted material. So keywords and phrases. Some individuals like to use outlines that are written on pieces of paper. Some individuals like outlines that are on index cards. It doesn't necessarily make a difference. Make sure that the outline is something that's legible for you. So you can make the font whatever size you want, as large as you want. Remember, it's for your eyes. Use colors to your advantage, bolding and italics. And I would like to look at your outline. As I had indicated during the first class, in a real life situation, no one would see your outline, but of course this is a workshop situation. So I'm going to ask that either you send me your outline via email if it turns out that it's something that you've typed up on the computer. If you've handwritten it, if you can scan it or take a picture of it and then send it to me. And I just want to be able to take a quick look at it and be able to give you my feedback. So for instance, if your outline is on index cards, you might want to photograph it. I don't know if that would be something necessarily that you could easily send as an attachment. But Regardless of whatever it is you do with your outline, I'll try to give you some suggestions, but remember that the outline is much less important than the speech itself. So no one really is going to know whether you follow your outline or not. The outline is for your eyes only. It's almost like a GPS, in that the GPS will give you directions, and you can make a decision not to follow the GPS, but there's a certain level of risk involved. And it's the same thing with your outline. The outline is there, and you should follow it, and you might make a conscious decision not to when you are in the moment, but just understand that there's a certain level of risk involved. Many times students will list stage directions in their outline. So if there's something they want to do, show a prop or take a breath or something of that nature, they might remind themselves to do such a thing. And there's an example on page 119 of your textbook, if you're using the edition of the book that I had ordered for the class, about an outline for drunk driving. As I had indicated, I believe these outlines in the textbook are much too detailed to be useful for you when delivering a speech. They are useful for you as the reader of the textbook so that you can get an idea what a speech would sound like. And also, one of the reasons why it's useful to have an outline is because it can help you with your memory. And individuals have been shown to have notoriously poor memories. In fact, some studies have shown that individuals can remember anywhere between plus to minus 7 items to plus to minus 3 items. And plus to minus 3, if you do minus 3, that's 2 or 1. That's very little. Now, obviously, we can remember more information than that, but it requires effort on our part in order to be able to do that. So, for instance, you might use repetition, repeating something constantly so that you can remember it. Or you might use chunking. In other words, you're grouping like items together so that it turns out that you have fewer items ultimately to remember. Phone numbers are a very good example of that, where you don't necessarily have to remember a phone number by its individual digits. You don't have to remember 7751000. Instead of 1000, you could remember 1000, and that's one thing rather than 4 separate elements. 7751000 happens to be the GCC phone number, by the way. Mnemonic techniques, memory techniques to help you remember things like songs, jingles, acronyms, where you're using the first letter of each word in order to create a new word to help you remember something, oftentimes used in mathematics and music and science, even in writing. An acronym for writing that I often talk about is KISS. Keep it simple, silly, or you might have heard it as keep it simple, stupid, though that seems to be a little bit harsh. So all of these techniques are useful for you, but they're also useful for the audience if you are trying to help us remember something. And this becomes particularly important when we get to the informative speech where you're trying to teach us something. So if there are any techniques that you can utilize to help us remember, such as utilizing repetition or giving us a mnemonic technique or chunking items together, then we are more likely to remember the information. So Chapter 8 happened to be about beginning and ending speeches. And while the entire speech is important, the beginning and the ending of the speech is particularly important. And the reason why is because of something called the primary recency effect, which means that we best remember what we hear first and what we hear last, and what we see first and what we see last. You could perhaps try this with a memory that you might have about something like a vacation, where the idea is that you can remember the beginning and the ending of it much more than you could remember the midsection of it, generally speaking. So if the introduction and the conclusion are going to be so important, the first and the last impression, then you need to put a little bit of extra something into that introduction and conclusion. Now, there are lots of different ways that you can put together that intro and conclusion. Obviously, the bulk of the speech won't be spent on the intro and conclusion. The bulk of the time of the speech will be on the body. But again, with the way that people's memories work, they're more likely to remember the beginning and the ending. So some ideas or some suggestions that I've got for introductions and conclusions. And again, my suspicion is that these are techniques that you've utilized in your own writing as well. First, reality. So if you can talk about something that's real and that happens to be occurring now within our time, chances are that people are going to be paying interest. Proximity, something that happens to be nearby. And again, I oftentimes talk about how when I scan the news, chances are if there's an article about education, which is something that is related to me, I will stop and at least pay some attention to it. If it's about higher education, I will definitely stop and pay some attention to it. And if it's about Greenfield Community College, I'll read it in its entirety, even if I don't necessarily have the time to read it in its entirety, just because that's my school. So, in other words, things that are real and things that are nearby tend to be a way to captivate audiences. Things that are familiar as well. That said, we also enjoy suspense and conflict, which seems to be the exact opposite of what it was that I've just said. But think about how news stories work, where oftentimes you've got news stories that are supposed to be comforting and familiar, but then you've got the news of the odd and things that are suspenseful or things that, in one way or another, are unusual. Humor can be very effective for an introduction or for a conclusion, though you've got to be careful with humor because a lot of times what's funny to an individual may not necessarily be funny to someone else. Humor is oftentimes culturally based, and we'll talk about culture a little bit more as the semester progresses. Just stating something as important is a good technique for beginning or ending a paper or a speech. And again, all of these don't necessarily stand as independent individual units. You can mix and match along the way. Question and answer. I don't know if you've ever heard of a rhetorical question in which you ask a question to your audience where you don't expect an answer. And one of the reasons why you do that is because it's very natural whenever a question is asked that someone is going to want to be engaged enough to answer it. And I found this myself in my early days of teaching when I would ask a rhetorical question. In fact, I still do. In my Shakespeare class about a play called The Midsummer Night's Dream. And if you know anything about A Midsummer Night's Dream, it's a play about multiple couples falling in and out of love because of a magic spell by a group of fairies. So there's a fantasy element associated with it. And it turns out that the queen of the fairies, because of the magic spell, falls in love with a character named Bottom, who's very aptly named because he's at the bottom of the social scale. He's a laborer. And he also is sort of an idiot. He acts like, for lack of a better word, an ass. And it turns out that one of the fairies, in a prank, decides to have a little fun with Bottom and turns Bottom into a donkey, a literal ass. So this queen, again because of the spell, falls in love with Bottom, the ass, who's a literal donkey. And my students sometimes have some difficulty understanding how this could be, even with the influence of a magical spell. So the rhetorical question that I ask at this point to try to illustrate how Shakespeare is timeless and universal is, how many of us have ever fallen in love with an ass? And my expectation was a few chuckles. And I remember the first time I asked that rhetorical question, a question to which I did not expect an answer, there were several hands in the air of individuals who wanted to share their stories of their love relationships with their own asses and how individuals can be blind in love. So just again illustrating how timely Shakespeare is, even in today's world. But there is something about asking a question that tends to engage audiences. Using a quotation is a good way to begin or end a speech. There are lots of different ways you can find quotations. I'm always wary about just going on Google and finding the first search hit I get, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about research for our last speech, the persuasive speech. But if you are looking for a reliable resource for quotation, Bartlett's Familiar Quotations. I suppose it's the Webster's Dictionary, if you will, quotations. And you can find an online version for free if you wanted to, and that will be something that you can definitely trust. Certainly if you find something on Google, that doesn't mean that it's incorrect. You just want to verify it because you're not necessarily sure that somebody has just posted something that isn't exactly correct. And I've seen this more than once where things have been posted on Google that have been attributed to, let's say, Shakespeare, and they were never written by Shakespeare. Storytelling. People love stories. Now, the story should be related to whatever your speech is about, just like the quotation should be related to whatever your speech is about. But that's a good way to engage an audience in an introduction or a conclusion. Making some sort of personal reference to yourself and connecting it to the topic of the speech is a good introduction conclusion. Forecasting and summarizing. In other words, in the introduction, telling the audience what you're going to talk about. In the body, talking about it. And in the conclusion, reminding us what you talked about. or even a startling statement. And this can be done well or this can be done poorly in terms of shocking the audience. And I believe I shared a story with you last class about a student at another institution who actually tried to disrobe during the performance of his speech. I suspect this was a way that he was trying to shock the audience and it backfired. But I can share a story with you where it didn't backfire and it occurred with me during a speech. And it happened to be in an evening class that I was teaching. It was a 3-hour class and we had a break in the midsection. This is where most people would go to grab something to eat. And then after the break, we would continue on with delivering our speeches. And I certainly wasn't paying attention. I was pulling all my notes together. No one else was really paying attention because they were either eating or they were getting ready for the second half of the class. And then all of a sudden I begin to hear someone coughing. And I look up from my notes and I see that the student all the way in the back of the room appears to be choking. And if you've ever had the experience where it seems that time freezes, that's exactly what I experienced. And a million thoughts went through my mind about how I should proceed and how I needed to get to that student to try to assist. Did I remember how to perform the Heimlich maneuver? I needed to call security. So all of these thoughts are running through my mind as I'm standing up. And I didn't get past standing up before another classmate reached the choking victim, performed the Heimlich, and out popped from the choking victim's mouth a rolled ball of paper. It was quite surreal. And all of us are staring at this rolled ball of paper in the middle of the floor. And then the person who performed the Heimlich maneuver slowly walks to the front of the stage, gently pushes me aside because I was at the front of the room, and announces that what we just witnessed was a simulation of a choking. However, if it had been a real choking, would we have known what to do? And that his speech that day was on the Heimlich maneuver. And he continued on from there. And basically, he was scheduled to deliver his speech after the break. He had ensured that without telling me why. And the reason why was because he wanted to shock us. And he was quite successful in doing it. So I always remember this as a very successful attempt with startling or shocking the audience. And yes, there was some risk involved. Something could have gone wrong. I mean, ultimately, somebody else could have tried to perform the Heimlich on the supposed choking victim. And when you perform the Heimlich, you can actually break ribs when you do it for real. It's a rather significant procedure. So that could have happened, or the person who was pretending to choke on that piece of paper might have begun to really choke, and the savior might not have been really performing the Heimlich because that's what they prepared to do. So lots of things could have happened, but it didn't happen. And I will always remember that speech about a topic that some people might consider to be a bit dry, an informative speech on performing the Heimlich maneuver, but it ended up being an incredibly memorable speech for all of us in the room. So put some thought and effort into your introduction and conclusion. As I indicated, we'll be watching some sample speeches from students over the next couple of classes, and that'll give you some ideas as well. The last chapter I wanted to talk about today was about wording your speech. And as I indicated, your language is not going to be as precise as it would be if you were writing a paper, nor should it be, because you want to have a certain level of spontaneity with your audience. So you want to have the oral style of presentation, not the written style of presentation. The oral style of presentation is much more conversational. It has simpler vocabulary, shorter sentences, and it's much less formal. So in terms of some of the things that you can consider with manipulating language, definitions can be fun. And this was not, I believe, included in your textbook, but you've got the denotation of a word, or the dictionary definition, and the connotation of the word, the associations of a word. And two words might have very similar denotations or dictionary definitions, but very different connotations or associations. And that can influence how your audience responds to your message. Take two words like cheap and frugal. Both basically mean the same thing, the same denotation. You don't spend a lot of money. But cheap is viewed as negative and frugal is viewed as positive. Those are the associations behind it. So calling someone cheap is going to result in a very different kind of reaction than if you call someone frugal. So at least being aware of the power of language. And usually when we talk about definitions, we define what something is. There is the possibility that you could use a negative definition, defining what something is not. So, for instance, if you were to look up the definition of the word rich in the dictionary, it would probably talk about monetary wealth. However, you could use a negative definition for rich. By rich, I don't mean financial wealth, I mean health and happiness. So, in other words, here I've defined what it is. If rich is not financial wealth, it's health and happiness. So you can utilize definitions in that respect as well. And think about how definitions so oftentimes rely on context, the contextual definition that's determined by the situation. So when I'm talking about brief in an academic context, I'm probably talking about being concise. But if we were in a fashion class and I was talking about brief, I would probably be talking about an article of clothing. And if we were in law school and I was talking about brief, we would probably be talking about a report. So again, language is influenced by lots of different factors. And I'm well aware that we are at the beginning stages of delivering speeches. So we're thinking about things like taking deep breaths and greeting our audience and saying goodbye, rather than some of the advanced techniques of language. But I have included some of the advanced techniques for language so that when you become comfortable with the actual presentation of speeches, you can begin to play a little bit with language. And if you think about some of the great speakers in our society, and they oftentimes have been able to use things like imagery and rhyme and alliteration, and many literary techniques that we expect from authors, and they do that as well as being able to deliver their message. So Martin Luther King, for instance, and I Have a Dream speech is usually cited as an exceptional example of delivering a speech. But there are many speakers who have been shown to have great aptitude with using language. I don't know how you feel about his politics, but regardless of his politics, Jesse Jackson is a very skilled speaker, if you happen to know who Jesse Jackson is. But basically, using things like imagery, in other words, the senses. Advertisements do this very well, where they utilize touch and smell and scent in order to engage the audience. It assists with visualization. So that's one of the things you can do with your language, is using imagery. Metaphor, when you are comparing two different things without using like or as. If you happen to use like or as, that's called a simile. But again, it's oftentimes a literary technique that's used in poetry in particular, but can also be used in drama or a short story or a novel. A rhyme. This is where the endings of words have similar sounds. Again, this is something that we oftentimes see in poetry or in song. Or alliteration. This is where the beginnings of words have similar sounds. So you can play with language, and I encourage you to do it, but only after you've become comfortable with the elements, the basic elements of delivering a speech. You don't have to keep yourself to the standard of Martin Luther King in delivering a speech. What you want to do is to be able to communicate your message to the audience effectively. So that's what you should be focusing on. When you are using language, try to be audience-centered, using language that's appropriate for that particular audience. So for instance, if you were speaking to a group of children, my suspicion is that your vocabulary would be much more simplistic than if you were speaking to a group of adults. So you want to tailor your language to the audience. You don't necessarily want the audience to tailor themselves to you. You want to tailor yourself to the audience. And you want to try to use neutral terms whenever possible, terms that are culturally sensitive and terms that are inclusive. And that said, I know that oftentimes this can lead to a great amount of debate. And in the end, I suggest that you just use common sense and good intent. So that I think all of us have perhaps not necessarily used the most inclusive language possible. And I think about myself when just about on a daily basis, I ask, has the mailman delivered the mail? And I should be asking about the postal carrier. And if I were writing this, I would ask postal carrier, but old habits die hard. My suspicion is if I were ever in an emergency and I needed help from a fireman or a policeman, I would probably say those words first rather than saying firefighter or police officer, even though I know better. So the idea is that the audience understands what it is you're saying, and it's not deliberately offensive. Pronouns can be particularly tricky, particularly in today's world. The he pronoun has been used for many, many years, maybe since the beginnings of time and language, to denote both male and female. And of course, there's been outcry about that. And the best way of dealing with that is try to put everything in the plural. So rather than talking about he or she, a doctor should examine his patients. You can say doctors should examine their patients. You can always say he/she, but then there are questions of why the he goes before the she. Should the she go before the he? And if that is in one way or another a reverse of the exclusivity that language has shown in the past. And of course, there's the question of whether or not gender is that simple, that binary as a he or a she. So usually what I suggest is to try to use plurals and also to try to be culturally sensitive, but also don't let that get in the way of your being able to communicate with your audience. That's the most important thing of all. So if you do make an error, just continue on. If you think it's a significant error, you can draw your audience's attention to it. But my suspicion is that none of us are going to be perfect with our language when we speak. And that also goes with grammar mechanics as well. You might be relieved to know that while we certainly have standards with writing, in terms of language, people speak in sentence fragments and run-ons all of the time. So that said, just try to be aware of the language that you're using when you are presenting to your audience. So those were the 3 chapters that I had scheduled for today, with the attendance question due for Thursday on our class discussion board by 9 a.m. being, what do you think your biggest challenge delivering speech number 1 will be? What do you think your biggest challenge delivering speech number 1 will be, and why? Again, if you can send me an email with how it is you would like to do a practice session with me, I would be very appreciative. If you think you would like to do some sort of a practice, or if you think you would like to do some sort of a Zoom session with me, please also send me an email about that as well. And next class, on Thursday, what we will be talking about is Chapter 10, Delivering Your Speech, Chapter 4, Public Speaking and Cultural Challenges, and Chapter 5, Understanding Your Audience. And the good news is, believe it or not, after those 3 chapters, we will have finished the bulk of the textbook. As I had indicated, I wanted to put most of the textbook readings up front. And in an intercession class, each class is the equivalent of basically a week. So Friday, put some closure on things with the quiz based on the early chapters that we would have talked about. I'll give you 24 hours to complete that quiz and to send it to me via email. It'll be 20 questions, mostly short answer, but some multiple choice and some true false. You can utilize your notes, you can utilize class videos and so forth. And that's the day I have scheduled for us to touch base for our practice sessions, but of course we can make arrangements for other days as well, as long as it's before the 11th, which is when you are presenting speech number 1. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.